So hello, welcome. We are at the wonderful Lynn Y Fan, and today we're going to talk about camera settings for landscape photography. We're going to look at camera settings for two things. So camera settings for cameras using tripods and using handheld photography. And we're going to go into detail about use of aperture and ISO and how best to use your camera so you can be really adaptable and lightweight when you're doing your landscape photography. Let's go for it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is camera settings for a tripod. So the first thing to think about is basically when you use these settings, what is the point of using a tripod? And the short answer is that when you're using poor light, when the sun is just rising as it is here, you really need a low ISO. The ISO, if it's too high, it will degrade the quality. But I'm going to contradict myself later on in the video about ISO. But if you're using a tripod and you're trying to create still water, if you're trying to create a landscape piece of photography that has loads of detail in it, like this wonderful scene of Lynn Y Fan, then it's quite useful to use a tripod. So the cons and the problems with tripods are quite simple. They're bulky, they're heavy, they cut down your ability to use your instinct as a photographer. You can't just kind of move freely with them. And you need to choose carefully how and when you use them. So I'm gonna take you through some of my settings, and you'll see the settings up on the screen. So I was shooting handhelds, and we'll talk about handhelds later on. But for now, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to just make my ISO as low as I can possibly go. So I'm going to take my ISO down to ISO 64. That means I get very little grain in my shot. And the light sensitivity isn't great, but the quality is as high as it possibly can be. And then I'm going to go between f8 and f11. So that way I'm not getting any diffraction in my aperture, and I'm getting a really sharp shot. And then the last thing is my shutter speed. Now my shutter speed is just going to be dictated at the moment by what I choose as ISO and what I choose as an aperture setting. Now because it's on a tripod, it doesn't matter what your shutter speed is. Now, the next thing you can do to avoid any camera shake at all is you can change the release mode to a 2-second timer. And what that does is when you press the button and you take the photograph, it allows that shot to be taken without you touching the camera. And therefore, you don't get any vibration coming through your tripod at all. So tripods are fantastic for this kind of photography. We've got these beautiful clouds coming in. We've got the beautiful scene below us. I might just try a vertical shot of that as well. It allows us to get it, full ISO, full quality. Okay, I'm also bracketing my exposures here. So I'm doing a bracket of 3. So this is a Nikon Z7. Sorry, I'm just tightening up my tripod a little bit. This is a Nikon Z7. So I've put my bracketing menu here. And you can see you can either do 3, 5, or 7, or whatever you like. I'm just doing it a one-stop variable, so one stop in terms of light. So I'm going to take some portrait shots as well, just to get a bit of foreground interest and really kind of show Lynn Y Fan. Now, at the moment, Lynn Y Fan is undergoing some building work, so there's a whole load of builders down there at the moment. But it is a stunning place. I've come here in many different seasons, and I love this place. Anyway, back to the settings. So again, I'm going to use similar settings. I'm going to use ISO 64. I'm going to use a 1/6 of a second, and I'm going to use f8. I can also, whilst it's on a tripod, I can do some focus stacking if I want. Now my foreground isn't very interesting. I'll take some more interesting foregrounds and shots as we go along, but I'm just going to show you on this picture. So what I can do when I focus stack, what I'm doing is I'm bringing together the different elements of my photography, and with a tripod it's a brilliant time to do it. So I can take a shot here, so And this is then the foreground area covered, and you'll see it up on the screen. Then I can take a shot here in the midground. And then finally, I can take another shot for my background and my sky. So I've got 3 different sets of exposures for each shot, and I've got a different area of focus to make sure everything is in focus. And then I can take that into Photoshop and I can photo stack my image. So the last thing to do, and don't worry about this too much, but you need to do it a little bit, is just check your shots. So just go into your shots, check them for exposure and check them for sharpness. So I'm just going to zoom into this and just make sure that it's completely as it should be. So I'm just going to zoom around and just look for sharpness. Now, I've got to remember what shot this is, because I think this was my mid shot of the lake itself. And as you zoom in on the back of the screen, you can see that it's basically sharp all round. So tripods are fantastic for this kind of work, for low light, for getting as much detail in as possible, for smooth flowing water, for sky movement, for using filters and things like that. And that's where you really need to take one and carry one. But there are loads of instances where you don't, and that's what I'm going to be showing you next. But before then, I'm going to take a series of photographs and let's see what we can find. Okay, so now to landscape photography with handheld photography. Now, sorry, I've got this massive lump on top of my photography, on top of my camera. I'm just recording the screen so you can see what I'm doing. So it is all about a compromise between ISO, shutter speeds, and aperture. So instead of using f11, we're probably going to go for about f8 to f6. Instead of using ISO 64, we're going to go to about ISO 160 or even 200. And we're just going to make sure that you basically go as low ISO as you can, go as high aperture as you can, but just make sure that you don't go much below 1/50th of a second. That's the rule that I use. Because if you go much below that, then you're going to get camera shake and you're going to end up with pretty useless shots. So let's take a shot of this. So first of all, what we're going to do, I'm going to have it on the setting that I was using before. So if I change my release mode, instead of 2-second timer, I'm coming across to continuous high. And that will take 3 shots. Now when I'm doing this, you can see it goes to a 20th of a second. Now you could get away with that and it could be fine, but it's probably going to be too low and you're going to get some camera shake and some movement. So instead we compromise. I take the ISO up to roughly about 125 to 160, and then I'm going to take my aperture down to about f8, and with this particular lens it's still going to be really, really sharp, really in focus. It'll be absolutely fine. And then we're looking for that shutter speed. Now at the moment the shutter speed is at 100th of a second, which is fine. We've got this beautiful cloud coming over the top of the mountain here, and we're just going to take a series of bracketed shots. Now it just gives you the freedom and flexibility to move around and to just try lots of different positions really, really quickly without thinking too much, just using your instinct and just going for it. So again, I'm just going to quickly look at what I'm photographing here. This time I'm going to use the optical viewfinder for a second. Oh no, I better not do that. I'll stop screen recording. So I've got it on f8. I've got ISO 125, I could even try and go for f9, and that's still at 80th of a second. I'm going to bracket this because I'm photographing into the sun a little bit, and I want to pick up on the details in the foreground. So if I zoom into one of these shots, This is a slightly overexposed one. If I just zoom in here, you'll be able to see that pretty much throughout the image, it's still really, really sharp. Now, the great thing is you've got Lightroom. So you can use the denoise function in Lightroom to get rid of your noise if you're really bothered. But to be honest, there isn't that much of a difference between ISO 64 and ISO 160. There isn't a massive difference between f11 and f8. And then you've got the flexibility. You haven't got that weight and you haven't got that. So I would say anything that isn't sunrise, sunset, or anything to do with water, you don't really need a tripod. If it's midday, if it's morning like it is now and the sun's risen, you've got plenty of light in order to have more freedom and more flexibility. You could even take a pano shot just using a steady hand, and then you can stitch that together in Lightroom. So I'd really encourage people to get out there without tripods. It gives you more flexibility. Sometimes you can just take a camera bag. You can, and eventually, like you will find that there are times, like when it comes to the evening or blue hour, it will be a little bit more challenging. And in those cases, you just need to keep that camera as still as possible and then keep on checking and reviewing your settings. So, settings for landscape photography. I've just been doing some ND filter work as well. That's where you put a different stop ND filter on your camera, and it allows you to slow down that shutter speeds and really kind of blur out the water. For that work, you really need a tripod. So you need to be able to control your shutter speeds and control your camera and refine all the settings. But the most important thing about settings is this. You need to be able to practice until you can do them instinctually, until you know that if your camera's off a tripod, then it's roughly going to be between 100 ISO, anything up to about 400, to really push then that ability to use a sharp aperture of f8 or f7, and then have a shutter speed that will enable you to do handheld work. Conversely, a tripod, when you're using it for blowing water, when you're using it for low light situations, it's fantastic. And then you've got the luxury of not having to worry about shutter speed. So they're both really useful. I wouldn't set one against the other. They both have their place. So I hope you found this video really useful. So please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.